On a rare snow day in Austin, Texas, I finished Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King. It's one of his most underrated works, and I hope you enjoy my review.
When I came to the University of Maine in 1966, there was still a Goldwater sticker, tattered and faded but perfectly readable, AU H2O 4 USA, on the old station wagon I inherited from my brother. When I left the university in 1970, I had no car. What I did have was a beard, hair down on my shoulders, and a backpack with a sticker on it reading, "Richard Nixon is a war criminal." The button on the collar of my denim jacket read, "I ain't no fortunate son." College is always a time of change, I guess, the last major convulsion of childhood, but I doubt there were ever changes of such magnitude as those faced by the students who came to their campuses in the late 60s. Most of us don't say much about those years now, not because we don't remember them, but because the language which we spoke back then has been lost. When I try to talk about the 60s, when I even try to think about them, I'm overcome by horror and hilarity. I see bell-bottom pants and earth shoes. I smell pot and patchouli, incense, and peppermints. And I hear Donovan Leitch singing his sweet and stupid song about the continent of Atlantis. Lyrics that still seem profound to me in the watches of the nights when I can't sleep. The older I get, the harder it is to let go of that song's stupidity and hold on to its sweetness. I have to remind myself that we were smaller then, small enough to live our brightly hued lives under the mushrooms, all the time believing them to be trees, shelter from the sheltering sky. I know that doesn't make any real sense, but it's the best I can do. Hail Atlantis.
Published in 1999, Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King is comprised of 5 interconnected shorter stories, set between the years 1960 and 1999. This is Stephen King's literary contribution to what living in the 1960s must have felt like. He says in the cover flap, "Although it's difficult to believe the 60s were not fictional, they actually happened." What results is one of Stephen King's most underrated works. In fact, when I Googled Stephen King books ranked, the first 2 hits I found didn't even list it.
I personally decided to reread Hearts in Atlantis, a book I read 25 years ago, not because it was about the 60s, but because of its tie-ins to The Dark Tower, King's magnum opus. I'm doing a very gradual reread of The Dark Tower of both the series and the 9 books that tie into that universe. But this work is a standalone that is still enjoyed both by those who have and those who haven't read The Dark Tower. The 1960s was one of the most tumultuous decades in American history, marked by the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, anti-war protests, and political assassinations. I'm not qualified to give you a history lesson about the 60s, but all students of history recognize the vast social and cultural upheavals that happened in that decade. This book had several very subtle narrative beats that made the 1960s feel very real to me, like little else that I have read. Hearts in Atlantis' structure is 2 long novellas, followed by 2 short stories, and a final story that's very short and almost an epilogue to the book. The first novella follows 11-year-old Bobby Garfield coming of age in Harwich, Connecticut. It's more a story of magical realism that ties to the Dark Tower than the 60s, but some of the themes about the 60s ring true, most notably Bobby's mother's struggle in the role of a single mother. She's struggling both at being a good mother to Bobby and also being in the workforce in a very sexist time for women in the workforce. I was reminded of how truly great Stephen King is at writing from a child's perspective. It's one of his more underrated strengths as an author. This novella tells the story of a man named Ted who moves into Bobby's building and befriends our young protagonist. But the story ultimately deals with the events surrounding Bobby, which cause him to grow up rather quickly. The second novella is set 6 years later and follows a student at the University of Maine who is in school with Carol, Bobby's friend in the first story. For me, this was the greatest part of the book and the reason I rated it so highly and feel it is so underrated. This is one of the few times an author has successfully transported me into this time period in such a vivid and visceral manner. Seeing these college students' eyes opened upon really learning about the war is something I found illuminating. This novella and book also showcases King's elegant writing style, which is never overly dramatic nor melodramatic. Some of the narrative beats in this novella with a lesser author would have surely been a bad source of melodrama. One example is the matter-of-fact way in which King mentions a college professor reluctant to fail a male student, knowing that a male student who drops out is likely to be sent to Vietnam to die. In the hands of a lesser author, this minor plot beat would be used as some grand gesture at the end of a paragraph or chapter to drive home the point. The way in which King dropped several of these significant storytelling beats in such a subtle manner, illustrating what it truly must have felt like to live in this tumultuous time, is a perfect example of a storytelling mastery. Parts 3 and 4 are short stories that deal with two young men who are supporting characters in the novellas, dealing with the aftermath of their experience in Vietnam. One is set in 1983 and the other in 1999. They could not have been two very different stories, as both men dealt with their war experience in different ways, but both stories drove home important points while making you empathize for their war experiences. In the final part, Bobby returns to Harwick for the first time in 40 years. I found the ending cathartic, and it beautifully tied all the disparate parts together. If you lived through the 1960s, or wish to read a great book of literary fiction that will possibly make you feel like you lived through the 1960s, this is a book that you will enjoy.
In summary, this is one of Stephen King's most underrated works, and I'm glad that I decided to reread it this year. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. I plan on doing more videos like this dedicated to a single book, but each month I will also give a roundup review of everything that I read in that month with short reviews and ratings. Additionally, if you want more content, you can subscribe to me on Twitter, or I guess that's follow me on Twitter, @BooksFury, and you can see every time I finish a book, I'll do a one-sentence book review dedicated to that book, as well as a rating. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you next time.